Civil war appears to have broken out at GB News. Lawrence Fox has been suspended, Dan Wootton has been suspended, and another host has taken to the barricades for the right of raving misogynists to broadcast on our TV sets. The oddball deacon, Calvin Robinson, this morning tweeted this: "I will not be appearing on Dan Wootton tonight without Dan Wootton. Dan Wootton had a significant part to play in building GB News. He invited me along pre-launch. He also brought so many people on board, behind the cameras as well as on-screen talent, including the careerist, ambitious ones who are currently gunning for his job. These people are worse than the woke mob because these vultures are giving the mob ammunition and essentially escalating the channel's demise." He also went on to say this: "Our bosses are scared, afraid of Ofcom, afraid of the woke mob, and afraid they're going to run out of money unless they manage to sort this advertising problem out. We need to give them courage, not enable them to capitulate. If they pander to the woke mob, we are finished. Someone else might get the prime time slot for a bit, but it will not be a promotion if you jump in Dan's grave. You'll just be making space alongside his corpse for your own." Now, I've only read you a section of his tweet. That was a real essay which he put up on Twitter, or now X. He had a much shorter tweet a couple hours later: "I have been suspended from GB News." So another one bites the dust. On the reason for Dan Wootton's suspension, which is what prompted Robinson's glorious act of sacrifice, Pop Bitch has reported this: "Even though on screen he might have looked just hopelessly out of his depth, the reason Wootton has incurred the wrath of his bosses is because he was repeatedly and actively ignoring multiple management commands. From the start of Fox's rant, the voice in Dan's earpiece was telling him to stop Fox, to push back and apologise, but he tuned it out. Then one of the senior bods drafted an apology for him to read out after the item, and he skipped past it on the auto cue. Then the top brass were on the phone to the studio insisting Dan apologise on air, and he just didn't." That's interesting. That's to Pop Bitch. It's sort of like an email which sort of emails out gossip from the world of politics and media. Now, potentially that was briefed in a sort of self-serving way, because essentially what that's saying is, the management, the producers, we were all on top of this. We were doing the professional thing, and it was all Dan ignoring us. So, that could be a briefing to this website, which is trying to protect management. We've got no idea. Either way, it sounds like Dan Wootton is in a bit of trouble.
If you look at, for instance, three people involved here: Dan Wootton, Lawrence Fox, and Calvin Robinson. Particularly Calvin Robinson and Lawrence Fox, these people aren't journalists. I don't think they claim to be journalists. They weren't journalists before joining GB News, right? Lawrence Fox was an actor, started to get involved on social media, and Calvin Robinson was a man of the cloth. I think it's probably unsurprising, therefore, that the minute you have a major crisis organisation, which this is, they act in a way that's probably deeply unprofessional and unbecoming of people in that industry. Particularly, let's look at Calvin Robinson. He said, while there was an ongoing investigation into one of his colleagues, I won't do X publicly. He didn't say it privately. He tweeted it publicly. If there was any other media show in town, other than just GB News, with all the furore it's presently surrounding it, you would be suspended. Of course you'd be suspended. There's an investigation into a colleague of yours and you're slagging it off publicly. Of course you'll be suspended. You're bringing the organisation into disrepute. And I think for me, this really symbolises a clash between the utopians in the organisation, people like Calvin Robinson, Lawrence Fox, less Dan Wootton, people like that Coast guy, Neil, what's his name? People like that, utopians, and then people like Michelle Dewberry, Emily Carver, Patrick Christie's, Liam Halligan, their economics editor, very, very good broadcaster. I think Christopher Chope they've got from the Telegraph. These are people that want to build a really big media brand, clearly to the right of Sky News and the BBC, but which can compete at a national level and make the news, make the agenda, get stories. That's what they want to do. Okay, that's going to mean some sacrifices. That's going to mean some compromise, right? It's going to mean that you have to listen to what Ofcom says. You can't pretend you live in a world where Ofcom doesn't exist. It means you've obviously got to uphold certain standards, which obviously Lawrence Fox and Dan Wootton fell short of. And it means that when there are things like investigations into a colleague, which will happen in any large organisation over a long enough period of time, you don't behave like Calvin Robinson did on social media. And so I think, you have that clash between the utopians and the people that want to build a right-wing broadcast network, which we don't have in this country. We have newspapers like that, but we haven't got a broadcast network like that. So that's the clash. And I know right now it could be, GB News is going down the toilet, blah, blah, blah. I think, frankly, GB News doesn't have a future if it's the utopians, right? They basically want a YouTube channel. I don't think they seem to have grasped that if you carry on like that, I know Ofcom has no teeth and Ofcom hasn't done very much, but eventually, if you carry on like that, you will have your license withdrawn, right? Paul Marshall, I think, who's the chap who's funding it, he's not quite a billionaire. I think he's just short 900 million or something. Let's call him a billionaire. He's not pouring money into a broadcast license so that it can be removed. So I think it's an interesting moment. And for me, it kind of reflects actually some of the debates you would have seen on the left in the past. The way that Kevin Robinson and Dan Wood and Lawrence Fox, particularly Fox and Robinson though, Michael, they're behaving like student Trotskyists who've left their student union in the 1970s, and they think the rest of the world looks like their little revolutionary coterie of friends in wherever they were, Oxford or a red brick university. Of course, the world isn't like that. And it's a similar experience for these guys. I think they think that broadcast and Ofcom and the big wide world looks like Twitter. It doesn't. It doesn't. And if you think that, you're not prepared for the world of journalism. You should probably go somewhere else. Stay on Twitter. Have a YouTube channel. You can do that, by the way. And you can make that kind of content. You can't do it on a broadcast network. The most challenging political project that could arise from this is actually a serious network with serious people who are abiding by the rules, who are actually ingratiated within the establishment and tip it right. That's a serious thing. I think what these guys think is a serious thing is a complete clown show, which will just disintegrate on impact with reality.
You mentioned Ofcom there. Let's talk more about Ofcom, because the CEO of GB News has given his first interview since this whole story broke up. He's called Angelos Frangopoulos. He was sort of before this the CEO at Sky News Australia, which is actually more like Fox News than the Sky News we have here. He was on the Today programme, and as well as the Lawrence Fox issue, Amal Rajan asked him this.
Given your call GB News and it's a news channel, do you agree that one function of journalism is to apply scrutiny to power?
Of course it is.
Then why on earth
Absolutely.
have you got serving politicians presenting news programmes? Chat shows, debates, podcasts, that's all very different. News programmes is a specific thing, and they're not generally former MPs, so Nigel Farage is, they're current serving ones.
No serving MP hosts a news bulletin-based program on GB News. What they do is absolutely permitted under the Ofcom rules. And if Ofcom is currently looking at this. If that changes in the future, then obviously we'll look at it.
But you must have a pretty low opinion of journalists if you land a scoop with the Home Secretary, as you have done with Suella Braverman, who's given an interview to Lee Anderson, and you think the best person to interview them is Lee Anderson, who's her own party's deputy chair. He might be a hugely estimable, he might be a hugely impressive bloke, but he's not a journalist. And if you're a news programme, why don't you do the humble thing and get a journalist to interview the existing Home Secretary?
Oh, Amal, this is where you're missing the whole point of what GB News is about.
You're not really about news, you're more about creating noise.
We are filling a gap in the landscape. We are not journalism for journalists. We're journalism for people. And that is a really big difference.
Right.
The conversations that happen between people like Suella Braverman and Lee Anderson, they are conversations. They're not interviews in the same sense as...
Sure.
As
I was going to say, it might be
the thing that's most unconvincing about that is Lee Anderson tweeted this week, scoop. He's got a huge scoop, which is he's got this interview with Suella Braverman. Now, scoop, that's the language of news, right? If you had an interview with Beyonce, right, on Pop World, you wouldn't call it a scoop. You'd call it, we've got this great interview coming up. It's not going to make the news necessarily. What you're going to do is you're going to have this conversation with someone. I suppose with Beyonce, it might make the news if, she had some new news about her life. But the fact of the interview isn't a scoop. Now, that's only a scoop if you're working in the news. So I don't find that particularly convincing. Obviously, it will be up to Ofcom. And the head of Ofcom has also given a rare TV interview this week. On the question of politicians hosting shows, she said this.
We've opened up audience research into this because actually the rules haven't changed over the last 20 years. And I think that's a really good thing to have that stability. But what has changed is our media landscape. We've got more and more shows coming in on TV and radio, but also we've got that wider social media landscape. I think a lot of the time what people are seeing is actually clips on social media which don't represent the whole programme. It's Ofcom's job to look at programmes once they've been aired in the round and see whether, if you're talking about impartiality, whether that's been preserved across the programme as a whole.
I guess some people might find that quite extraordinary what you just said, that it's a good thing that the rules haven't changed in 20 years. I mean, many people would say that's a really bad thing because the landscape has changed so dramatically. Gordon Brown last night, for example, said, because we've got a far wider range of broadcasters, the system of regulation is not good enough to cope for it. Ofcom needs to have more teeth. He's right, isn't he?
Well, certainly the government is opening up in the media bill the need to extend the number of services that we regulate to make sure that some of the streamers, for example, are caught by some form of broadcasting code that looks rather similar to what we do now for TV and radio. But I just want to say that freedom of expression, I think, is sometimes perhaps not as prominent in these debates as I think it should be. The rules are designed to uphold standards, particularly for news and current affairs, but also to preserve freedom of expression. And that's not just the freedom of expression of the broadcaster or the opinion former or the presenter. It's actually the freedom of the audience to hear a wide range of views.
I have to say, I found that quite a strange idea. How does the freedom of expression to watch GB News? It just seems that's just a very odd way of saying freedom of expression, or sort of an odd concept of freedom of expression. Now, what was interesting there is it did seem like she's very relaxed about all of this. And the only thing she seemed to be keen to talk about, the changes that were needed, was she wants to regulate more, right? So it seems like she's saying, well, TV, it's not that bad anyway. Like we want to start regulating social media. We want to start regulating streamers on YouTube and the like. And she seems very, very relaxed about Tory politicians hosting shows. This is very new, what GB News are doing, and it does seem like she should be a little bit more alert to making sure that it doesn't become a sort of cesspit of Dan Wootton's and the like, right? And it already is in many ways. As I say, I go on it because I think some shows they really give you a hearing and you can speak to their audience. The problem I have as well, though, with what she said, and this sort of, you have to give freedom of expression this sort of real big weight, is that it ignores the issue of money. You need a shed load of capital to make it work. So GB News started with £60 million seed funding. Last year, they made a loss of £30 million, right? So you have freedom of expression to broadcast on, broadcast channels, linear TV that goes into people's living rooms to sort of buy that space on the airwaves. You have freedom of expression if you can afford to sink £30 million over the course of a year. So it to me is a pretty, let's say, impoverished idea of what free speech and freedom of expression means, because it essentially says, if you can sink £30 million, you can say and do whatever you want and it will arrive on people's televisions in their living rooms. I think the idea of having an Ofcom or a regulator, which is a little bit more aggressive, is to say, actually, you can say whatever you want in the world, but the ability to stream on linear TV straight into people's living rooms is, that is almost a nationalized privilege, let's say. You have to meet certain democratic norms to get that privilege to go into people's living rooms. It can't just be based on the size of your wallet. And I'm a bit worried that what she was suggesting is basically to say, well, it is based on the size of your wallet. If you can afford to run a TV show, great, you're increasing media diversity. The problem is if you can increase media diversity as long as you've got enough money, then where is politics going to go? To the right, because it's the right who have all the cash.